Hey everybody, it's your boy, and before we start the video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe and comment on the video to help with that pesky algorithm. So anyway, on with the video. In his poem, The Second Coming, W.B. Yeats said, "Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." That was written in 1919 and published in 1920, over 100 years ago. One can assume he was writing as the Russian Civil War was raging, as Bolshevism seemed to be on the rise, the extremist violence in Germany between communists and conservatives like the Free Corps, anarchist terrorism in the United States, and also the Civil War in Ireland and similar social issues in the United Kingdom. But if you didn't know that poem was written 100 years ago, you would have imagined that this particular stanza was written yesterday. It seems to so perfectly encapsulate our time that it is impossible that the same issues that affected Yeats are now affecting us here today. Yet they are. This video isn't about the long march through the institutions by Marxist subversives and political operatives, nor is it about the short-lived alt-right reaction to it and the subsequent growth of quote-unquote traditionalist ideologies like trad Catholicism or the NRX, neo-reactionary movement, but about the centre, the collapse of it to be more precise. The video will also be about how the moderate position has been completely devastated by the extremist elements it is meant to keep in check. So how did the centre of politics collapse in the West, as it has buckled in other places like Russia, China and Iran, for example? Well, obviously it does have its roots as far back as you're willing to trace them. Some people will go back only a few years to the mainstreaming of so-called woke ideology. That simply will not do, because a cursory glance at the history of these ideas reveals that actually they've always been around in various guises for not just a few years, but a few decades. You can go back as far as the 1930s to 1950s, when the old academic establishment was systematically purged, replaced and defeated by what is now known as the old left, who in turn were defeated by the postmodern new left in the late 50s to the 1970s. Their ideas would then sift through the various institutions of Western countries until eventually they reached the mainstream. Meanwhile, agents that they either recruited or brainwashed at school and university were infiltrating political parties, corporations, and a host of other institutions and organisations. Of course, they didn't completely brainwash everybody, nor did they necessarily 100% control the whole of society, but they controlled the key areas in culture, education, the media and politics to the extent it didn't really matter. But to say that people were not at the very least influenced by the cultural Marxist ideas, at least nominally, is just wrong. That is at the very least the origins of the problems we now deal with. But how did they go about destroying the centre? What even is the centre? The centre ground is as dubious a concept as right or left wing politics is. We all know that we get the terms right and left from how the French Parliament was organised during the Revolution, with the more conservative or moderate elements on the right to the Jacobins etc. on the left. Of course, society these days does not even reflect the France of 1789 politically, and is much more ideologically diverse, with many people not fitting in any category comfortably. But essentially, the centre ground are the people who either do not fit in either category of left or right, or they may lean in certain directions, or as the stereotype goes, are undecided fence sitters. The centre ground is essentially normality, the normal people who aren't radical or extreme in any particular way. They have their biases, but they mostly agree with the other centrists who veer the opposite side and allegedly do not agree with everything that their extremist counterparts believe in. But does it actually work that way? For many people it does, but as we have seen in the recent past, it doesn't for most. Ultimately, centre-right and centre-left people are right and left-wing. They have their biases, as I said before. If a situation presents itself where one side fears it might lose out on anything, be it power, money, or fear for whatever reason that their country is in danger, they will side with the extremists, as opposed to siding with other moderates to form a bloc against the subversive elements. We have seen this all throughout the 20th century and our own times. In Italy, Mussolini, despite being a far leftist, managed to unite not only other non-Marxist leftists into his fascist government, but also conservatives on the right, liberals in the classical sense, and even centrists. Why? Because of the utter chaos that Italy was in. It was decided it was best to gamble with. Likewise in Germany, similar issues made the Nazis join a coalition government which ultimately gave Hitler the gateway to power, and it was the literal centrist party in a foolhardy power play to control him that gave him that. And of course, recently in America, we have seen the centre-right, the neocons and the centre-left, the neoliberals, join forces with the cultural Marxist far left against Trump. People like Mitt Romney and John Kasich, who are meant to be Republicans, were signing against their own party because they disliked the president because he was perceived to be shaking up their kooky system. Kasich literally voted for Joe Biden, his alleged opponent. Likewise, in the UK, the Tory party has, until recently, paid lip service to cultural Marxist garbage and were anti-Trump despite his pro-Britain stance and pro-Joe Biden despite his anti-Britain stance. In America, this push from the centre-right of the Republican Party was met with an equal reaction, with the libertarian and the MAGA elements pushing even further away from the centre to the right. What made these people, who were meant to be moderates, join forces with the cultural Marxists and ultimately destroy any semblance of a centre ground? Why did they think going against their best interests would be in their best interests? Well, the problem lies in many areas. First off, political bias. It is a given that neocons and neoliberals would be more inclined to back literal communists over the less radical Trump faction. Neoconservatism and neoliberalism both have their origins in former Trotskyist philosophers, like Strauss. So they were already veering left anyway, socially. The neocons may be less Keynesian than the neolibs, but they are hardly socially conservative in most cases. They may also think that because they have been in charge of their respective parties since the 1960s and 70s, they feel confident that they can rein in those communists and tame the beast. Yet, as we have seen, they do nothing of the sort. They only cede further and further ground. They also share similar goals. They have an enemy in the populist right led by Trump and the surrounding ideologies like libertarianism. They also have the same goals to accrue power, like curbing Second Amendment and First Amendment rights. So it makes sense that someone like Kasich would vote for Joe Biden, who in turn is using the support of true radicals like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to not only try and curb the division within his own party, but to stop the little work that Trump has done to undermine their corrupt deep state. Now, I am not suggesting that every centrist in each party has picked the far left. There are outliers, of course. Tulsi Gabbard is a pariah on the left because she refuses to conform, unlike Bernie Sanders, who has. Likewise, establishment Republicans like Ted Cruz, untrustworthy as he is, seemingly do not want to back the far left. I cannot recall if he was one of the traitors against Trump, but he has not been one of the neocons that sided with the left as far as I can see. But it is pretty clear, at least nowadays, that the centre-left especially would rather just back the radicals who don't like them and either become more radical themselves or just hope that when the populist right is defeated, they can once again tame the communists. They would rather back the people that, although highly dangerous to society, are nonetheless ideological brethren. Protecting your criminal sibling against the police would be an appropriate analogy here. Is this always a given? No, because it depends on context. But considering how human bias works, it may happen more often than not. But why would the centre-right side with literal communists? Well, as I said before, it has more to do with factionalism and pragmatism on their part. Even if, at the end of the day, as we have constantly warned them, it would only weaken their party, not strengthen it, if the more populist element is eliminated. There is ideological sympathy, but for most of them, it's simply the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And as you are aware on this channel, I believe that mantra is to be simply inviting a stab in the back. This has, as I said before, led to the other side becoming more entrenched towards the right and vacate the centre. Though luckily for us, the far right is actually not fascists and Nazis as many have been led to believe, but is actually anarcho-capitalism. Not only have the vast majority of MAGA and other libertarians within that sphere not gone over to that part of the spectrum, they've only become more sceptical of government, which is good. Although there has been an increase in not only blackpilling, but self-delusion, that there's going to be some kind of plan. But in the end, the centre has been lost and the foundations of American politics, as well as other Western countries, is quickly collapsing as a result. So how do we go about fixing it? I will try to keep it brief, but we need to do these different things. First off, it's pretty clear to us all that cultural Marxism's ideology is corrupting and dangerous, which means we have to utterly defeat it. It will not only have to be defeated intellectually, which is a given, which means that no concessions should be given or compromises made. These people are not interested in that anyway, so why bother? It also has to be defeated institutionally, which means these people have to be challenged at first in every institution and company they have invaded. Which means people need to stop being cowards and keeping their head down at university or at work and start talking back at them. All the counter arguments are there, use them. Then of course that will have to transition into rooting them out of the institutions, which would require learning the arts of political subversion. Likewise, all the centrists who betray their own apparent principles, parties and the people must be kicked out of their positions of power and replaced with people who have principles and will not kowtow to the far left. This is probably going to happen in the GOP, but it has to be done everywhere. We are not in a position when we can just uproot the current system and destroy it. It has to be undone from the inside like the Marxists did. It also requires that when right-wing parties are in power, actually make changes and don't sit around and expect the left to give up. We have to rely on parties like the Republicans and Conservatives because they are the only vessels we have in the various democratic and republican constitutional monarchist systems systems that we live in the West. The centre-left is completely compromised. There is at the moment not enough principled centrists on the left side of things. There is at the moment not enough principled centre-leftists in the position to reclaim their parties or to side with us on the side of freedom. Most seem perfectly content to vote for Biden and then complain at the level of wokeness rising again. As long as these right-wing parties have been purged of their wet elements, like your Boris Johnsons and Mitt Romneys of the world, and replaced with principled libertarians or sane conservatives who are not cowards, the better. But that's all I can really say. And it's nothing that I haven't said before. The crushing of the extremists will hopefully make things gravitate to a more sane and moderate level, and the foundations can then be repaired. It will take years to accomplish, and a lot of relationships need to be repaired, bonds reunited in society before true normalcy can be brought back. Until next time, I'll see you all later.